We're going to start today with the latest in COVID mania, what it has revealed about our society, and why I believe it should make us feel good about the future. First off, it has been fascinating to watch as many hysterical people come to the grips with the realities of COVID. Like, you can catch and spread it even if you're vaccinated. The vaccines help prevent severe and deadly outcomes, and that is all. COVID hits red states no harder than it hits blue states. Most masks do zero to prevent COVID. Yes, all of these are becoming clear now, even to the leftists. Lockdowns are an unnecessary disaster. School closures, same. Hospitalizations of children are being grossly overstated. They are including children hospitalized with COVID instead of just children hospitalized because of COVID. And finally, relying on the number of COVID cases as proof of COVID severity is pointless. The relevant metrics are hospitalizations and deaths. COVID is here to stay. We need to live with it, not live cautiously biding our time until it's gone. If you've been consuming independent or more conservative press, you have known all of this. If you have been relying on leftist corporate media for your information these past 2 years, this may be news to you. Take, for example, Nicole Wallace. This is an educated person who once called herself a Republican and worked for the Bush administration. Now she's in lockstep with the Joy Reids of the world. Take a listen to this person.
I'm a Fauci groupie. I'm a thrice vaccinated mask adherent. I buy KN95 masks by the, caseload. They're in every pocket. I wear them everywhere except when I sit down. And I am certain that this is not a variant I can outrun.
First of all, the stomach-turning, embarrassing virtue signaling. That's a good girl, Nicole. Good girl. You worship a government bureaucrat who has lied about COVID repeatedly. And you got all your shots, and you wear your N95 masks, and you never leave home without them, and you muzzle your children all day long. What a good girl you are. Let me rub your belly. But what's really happening here is she is starting to see the truth. And by the way, that truth existed before Omicron, when you could still get COVID despite the vaccine and despite the mask, Nicole, even if you were a Democrat. The dirty little COVID veil is starting to fall away from her eyes, and certain truths that have been obvious to the rest of us for months are dawning on her. And it's not just Nicole Wallace. Joe Biden, who eviscerated President Trump for COVID deaths on his watch and ran for office on the promise that he would shut down the virus, finally admitted there are limits to what the federal government can do.
There is no federal solution. This gets solved at a state level.
State level. There's no federal solution. This is the same person who said Donald Trump should be booted from office because some 200,000 Americans had died of COVID at the point he made the argument. Far fewer than would die on Joe Biden's watch, which, by the way, was all post-vaccine.
220,000 Americans dead. If you hear nothing else I say tonight, hear this. Anyone who's responsible for not taking control, in fact, not saying I take no responsibility initially. Anyone who's responsible for that many deaths should not remain as president of the United States of America. And this president, if he's reelected, you know what will happen. Cases and deaths will remain far too high.
Now we're over 800,000 deaths in America. And the cases are as rampant as they have ever been here. Now that that's the case, it's, well, no president can solve this. As Rich Lowry of National Review asked this weekend, where does Trump go for his apology? The rise in Omicron, a relatively mild virus, thankfully for the vast majority of people who get it, has forced even the prophet Fauci to admit that the obsession with case numbers as a metric for community response is off base.
As you get further on and the infections become less severe, it is much more relevant to focus on the hospitalizations as opposed to the total number of cases.
More shockingly, he has finally finally, almost 2 years into this pandemic, admitted the need to balance the goal of minimizing COVID with the need to live our lives as Americans, a free people. The CDC last week, with Fauci's blessing, shortened the quarantine time for people with COVID and those in close contact with them down to 5 days from 10.
I mean, obviously, if you have symptoms, you should not be out. But if you are asymptomatic and you are infected, we want to get people back to the jobs, particularly those with essential jobs, to keep our society running smoothly. So I think that was a very prudent and good choice on the part of the CDC.
You see, he's saying there are other things to consider beside this obsession with zero COVID. We have to keep society rolling. We have to keep business open. We can't just hover shelter in place and live in fear. That's essentially what he's saying, that there is a need for balance. Believe me, from Fauci, that's huge. Now, some leftists, told for months by Fauci and others that the virus remains contagious for at least 10 days. You got to quarantine for at least 10 days. Now they're mad. They don't see the return to work as a valid explanation for exposing contagious people to the world. And now they're saying, well, we might moderate it. Maybe we're going to say 5 days, and then you can come back to the workforce if you get a positive test. Well, why didn't they say that to begin with? Because there aren't any tests, because they know they didn't create tests. They didn't encourage the creation of tests, and they can't really require tests of people because nobody can get them. That's their own creation. That's their own problem that they created. So we'll see if they change that or not. But the truth is that 10 days was a made-up standard from the beginning, as was the 6 feet distancing rule, as was the cloth mask rule, as was the 70% for herd immunity rule. I could go on. The point is, we have been lied to. We have been actively misled. We have been led around like mules on a tether by government bureaucrats like Fauci, who want to shut down your job while he makes north of $400,000 a year, and we learned this week is set to retire with a pension of over $350,000 a year. These people want to muzzle your kid all day at school while they parade around maskless at dinners and the Met Gala and so on. They want to scare parents into sticking an experimental vaccine into their kids' arms over and over and over. Not 1, but 2 shots, and then a mandatory 3rd, or no sports or school or indoor fun of any kind, despite the data that unvaccinated young people face a risk far less severe than that of fully vaccinated adults. By the way, the Justice Department just admitted in a filing in support of its vaccine mandate that people between the ages of 18 and 30 have about the same risk of from COVID as those who are 50 plus who are fully vaccinated. So the unvaccinated 30-year-old has about the same risk as the fully vaccinated 50-year-old. And yet we're firing people. We're firing 18 to 30-year-olds for not getting the vaccine. They had to admit it in court. You see, just like Trump and his election story, when they get into court, they start to tell the truth. And the Biden administration is telling the truth about the real risk young people face. And it's minuscule and does not justify vaccine mandates or any of this nonsense. And their lies are starting to be exposed. So while we continue to see outrages, I mean, not everyone's listening to reason. They're just starting to. We continue to see outrages like schools closing right now, despite the harm we know this causes the children. Thanks a lot, unions. Or letters like the one from our own boys' school proclaiming that, oh, of course, that's a quote, of course the boys will remain masked for the foreseeable future. Or the notice in my friend's New York City building mandating that all contractors, delivery personnel, and employees servicing residents in the building must now be fully vaccinated. Okay, so now your cleaning lady, your plumber, your pizza delivery guy, they got to get vaxxed to do their jobs? Despite all of that, the house of cards is coming down. The realities of COVID are becoming undeniable. When even the leftists start to realize that COVID comes for all, even Democrats in New York City, even members of the media, the politics will moderate. Voters will make sure of it. There are enough conservatives and independent and center leftists out there that voters will make sure of it. And for that reason, we should be hopeful that this madness will soon be over. We begin today with the COVID lies being told by our alleged leaders. From the liberal Supreme Court justices to the head of the CDC, our so-called elites continue to mislead us on the realities of COVID. Why? Because they are agenda, not fact-driven. And once they decide that a policy is right, fact manipulation is entirely permitted, so long as it's in service of that policy, like the obsession with vaccines. What happened at the Supreme Court on Friday was a great example of it. It was truly shocking in its gall. The liberal Supreme Court justices bandied about, quote, facts, like Justice Sotomayor's claims that there are over 100,000 kids in the hospital for COVID. Many on ventilators, she said. In fact, the number is at max 3,500. Okay, not 100,000. And she also claimed that Omicron is as deadly as Delta, which even Dr. Fauci has said is not true, etc. Phil Kerpen of the American Commitment Foundation will join us in a minute with the best fact check you will hear anywhere on what happened at SCOTUS on Friday. His brief was cited repeatedly in Friday's Supreme Court arguments about the legality of the Biden vaccine mandates. He's appalled by what these left-wing justices said and did. I've never seen anything like it. I practiced law for 10 years. I covered the high court for 3 years, and I've never seen anything like what they did on Friday. They made stuff up left and right. And it was shocking to witness. None of it was in the record, right? You're not allowed to do that. You can take judicial notice of a fact that we all know, like the sky is blue, but not 100,000 kids are in the hospital when they're not, based on COVID. But before we get to the Supreme Court, I want to focus first today on Rochelle Walensky. We've criticized the CDC director before here on this program for behavior more befitting a college co-ed than a woman in this position, tearfully warning of impending doom long after the virus's most lethal months had passed. Remember that? Telling us how scared she was of COVID. That's helpful. And offering the story of how last summer she told her teenage son, who she said had been looking forward to summer camp all year long, that he couldn't go, even though millions of children would go to summer camp in 2021. And by the way, the summer prior, without any problem whatsoever. Remember when COVID was beginning to wane for a while and she tried to switch the messaging to masks forever, tweeting about how masks prevent all sorts of viruses having nothing to do with COVID-19. Well, that's none of your business, whether I want to wear a mask or not to prevent the common cold on an airplane, Rochelle. I figured this woman was just another hardcore left-wing COVID hysteric who had managed to scare herself into oblivion. But this weekend, a different reality emerged. Rochelle is apparently a partisan hack. Why else would she jump through such hoops to avoid calling out Justice Sotomayor's BS at the U.S. Supreme Court? The hard time she gave Fox News Channel's Bret Baier on his most basic attempts at a fact check reveal a partisan determined to change the subject, not someone concerned about the credibility of public health messaging. Watch this. First up, on Justice Sotomayor's claim about 100,000 children being hospitalized, many, she claimed, on ventilators.
We can find from Friday suggests there are fewer than 3,500 current pediatric hospitalizations from COVID-19. Is that true?
Yeah, but, here's what I can tell you about our pediatric hospitalizations now. First of all, the vast majority of children who are in the hospital are unvaccinated. And for those children who are not eligible for vaccination, we do know that they are most likely to get sick with COVID if their family members aren't vaccinated.
Understood. But the number's not 100,000. It's roughly 3,500 in hospitals now.
Yes, there are. And in fact, what I will say is while pediatric hospitalizations are rising, they're still about 15-fold less than hospitalizations of our older age demographics.
Why did he have to press to get her to answer that? First, she said, yeah, it's true. No, it's not true. He pressed. Then she admitted it's not true because she can't deny it. It's such an obvious lie. And then she went back to her obsession. Vaccination. That's all she can focus on. Shouldn't the CDC director care that a major figure in the United States is putting out shocking misinformation on children and COVID in a highly watched Supreme Court hearing? Isn't it her professional obligation to correct that? She did finally admit that there are at most 3,500 kids in hospitals with COVID right now, not 100,000, but only after she tried to dodge. Brett had to pin her down. Why? And even then, it was immediately on to how the kids who are hospitalized are unvaccinated, and no context on how the vast majority of kids in the hospital right now are there with COVID, not because of COVID. An important distinction. Then he asks her about Sotomayor specifically. Does Rochelle Walensky feel a duty to correct this kind of misinformation? Listen to this.
Supreme Court is in the process of dealing with this big issue about mandates. And do you feel a responsibility as a CDC director to correct a very big mischaracterization by one of the Supreme Court justices?
Yeah, here's what I'll tell you. I'll tell you that right now, if you're unvaccinated, you're 17 times more likely to be in the hospital and 20 times more likely to die than if you're boosted.
Oh my gosh, she's like a robot. Vaccination, vaccination, vaccination. Even though that wasn't the question. And the truth is, vaccinations do not prevent the spread of COVID. In particular, Omicron, which is the variant of the day, and she knows that. Then he asks her about Sotomayor's other whopper, about the Omicron variant versus the Delta variant. You tell me, is this woman a straight shooter?
Questioning in the Supreme Court also said that Omicron was as deadly as Delta. That is not true, right?
We are starting to see data from other countries that indicate on a person-by-person basis it may not be. However, given the volume of cases that we're seeing with Omicron, we very well may see death rates rise dramatically.
Meanwhile, her buddy, Dr. Fauci, already gave up that farm in late December. Listen.
We know now incontrovertibly that this is a highly, highly transmissible virus. We know that from the numbers we're seeing. All indications point to a lesser severity of Omicron versus Delta.
Lesser severity. Why can't she just say it? By the way, there was also a study recently out of Houston Methodist showing Omicron is much more contagious than Delta, which we know, but does not, quote, appear to have the virulence, that's a tough word, or machismo, to really pack as much of a wallop as the Alpha or Delta strain. What's happening here is one far lefty trying to minimize the embarrassment of another. But that is not Rochelle Walensky's job. She's supposed to be loyal to the truth. She's supposed to represent us. She's supposed to give it to us straight. Not act as the PR hack of liberal icon Sonia Sotomayor. But she refuses to just be honest. And here, it is not her own COVID hawk hysteria motivating her. It's her partisanship. And we know it. It is wrong. And now she owes us more than just the truth. She owes us an apology. We begin today with new questions about whether we can trust the public health officials overseeing America's response to this pandemic. On Monday, we dove into CDC Director Rochelle Walensky's attempts to cover for Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who embarrassed herself last week from the bench, grossly overstating the number of hospitalized children with COVID. Yesterday, we reported about Walensky continuing to tout a discredited study on masking in schools. Today, we have proof that Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins of the National Institutes of Health have been willfully misleading the public on COVID's origins in an effort, it turns out, to protect China and themselves. Documents emerged this week that public health officials did not want us to see. They dodged FOIA requests and other attempts to get them, but House Republicans finally got their hands on emails between Doctors Fauci, Collins, and some of the world's top virologists discussing early on in the pandemic whether COVID-19 came from a lab. It turns out the very officials who dismissed that as a fringe conspiracy theory in the press were being told exactly the opposite by the world's top experts as early as February 2020. They have known from the start. The emails and notes, which only the lawmakers have seen, though they have transcribed them for the public, show that on February 1, 2020, Drs. Fauci and Collins had a teleconference about COVID's origins with 11 of the world's top virologists. Emails were exchanged the very next day that make clear several of those advising Fauci and Collins believed this virus came from a lab, not some bat or other animal from a wet market or a cave. They had studied the virus's genetic makeup, you see, and found the insertion of a genetic sequence that makes a virus more transmissible, a furin cleavage site. Physicist Robert Mueller was on our show in June explaining why the furin cleavage site in SARS-CoV-2 is indeed a smoking gun that proves lab origins.
There is a particular part on what's called the spike. You know, if you see a picture of the virus, it's a sphere with these spikes coming out. These spikes are what attach to the victim cell. Now, this spike in coronavirus has a particular feature that makes it extremely capable of attaching to a victim cell and injecting its virus particles very quickly. To get in so quickly and so effectively as to be really infectious, it has this little code in it. And the little code is something that has never been seen in this whole class of coronaviruses that include both SARS, which is famous, and MERS, the Mideast respiratory syndrome. Though neither of those had this in it. So this is really something unexpected, unique, and it's inconceivable that this could have happened by accident.
It was efficient. It was highly contagious to humans from the start. And that was a tell. The former director of the CDC, Robert Redfield, backed the lab leak theory publicly last summer, writing in the Wall Street Journal, "What virus comes out of a bat cave and infects humans by the millions? It's not biologically possible." One of those scientists on that call with Fauci and Collins, a Brit, Sir Jeremy Farrar, sent a follow-up email to Collins and Fauci the next day, expressing support for the lab leak theory. He relayed the thoughts of two more experts, Robert Gary of Tulane University and Michael Farzan of the Scripps Research Institute. Robert Gary, he said, can't think of a plausible natural scenario. And Farzan was, quote, bothered by the furin site and having a hard time explaining that outside the lab. Farzan, he said, favored lab leak over natural origin 70-30 or 60-40. We know from a book Sir Farrar wrote last year that two of the other experts advising Fauci and Collins were strongly in the lab leak camp as well. Christian Andersen of the Scripps Research Institute put the lab leak theory at 60 to 70% likely. Eddie Holmes of Sydney, 80%. In Farrar's emails, he said Holmes was at 60%, but either way, the guy clearly favored the lab leak origin. So, did Fauci and Collins create a commission to study this further, to get to the bottom of it? Did they call a press conference telling us all the lab leak theory deserved our full and serious consideration? After all, people were dying and would continue to die, 5.5 million and counting now. Didn't they want to know how this deadly virus got started so we could prevent it from happening again? Actually, they went another way. 2 days after those scientists went to Collins and Fauci and told them this thing likely came from a lab, 5 of them authored a paper on how the virus began, including at least 3 who had openly favored the lab leak theory. And in that paper, they did a complete 180, concluding that this virus was clearly, quote, that's a quote, clearly not from a lab and clearly not manipulated by man. Sir Farrar, well, he went on to write a different article, again, just days later, denouncing anyone who believed the lab leak theory as a bigot. Guess that includes himself and all his buds. Oh, and these same scientists took pains to assure us in their writings that soon the natural animal source would be found. 2 years, 209 species, and 80,000 animal examinations later, it hasn't happened. So why the about face? Were these guys strong-armed by Collins and Fauci, both of whom were involved in the draft article from its inception? Keep in mind, Fauci and Collins control the grant money from which many of these scientists make their living. You cross them, you're done. Your grants, your research, possibly even your career, gone. You do as they say, things get better for you. 6 months After they reversed course, Christian Andersen and Robert Gary reportedly received an $8.9 million grant from Fauci and Collins. It's funny how well that worked out. Fauci wanted the lab leak theory gone. He later called it a shiny object, reassuring colleagues it would go away. He also clearly backed the waffling scientist's article, which had been sent to him for editing, though it's unclear how, if at all, he changed it, taking to the White House podium and even mentioning the article there. Collins, for his part, is on record in these emails, making very clear his orders. This article was important to, quote, settle this matter. Wait, why? He wanted to, quote, put down this very destructive conspiracy about a lab leak, lest the experts do, quote, great potential harm to science and international harmony. International harmony? He means China. Shut up about the lab leak in Wuhan, China. Dr. Ron Fauchier, whose group in the Netherlands researches how to make animal viruses more dangerous, put it even more clearly in an email at the time. Further debate about such accusations would unnecessarily distract top researchers from their active duties and do unnecessary harm to science in general, and science in China in particular. And there it is, China. China had been America's biggest and most important collaborator in scientific research. Our collaboration with the Chinese over the past 20 years has grown exponentially, despite their human rights abuses and our occasional objections. We have been working together there and here on research just like what was happening in that lab. It is not at all clear we can blame them and only them. And not just any research, but controversial gain-of-function research that takes, say, a coronavirus and makes it more dangerous or contagious, possibly even to humans, allowing scientists ostensibly to get ahead of it. But what if? What if it gets ahead of them? Fauci was behind much of the U.S. funding in China. He admitted approving grants for EcoHealth Alliance, a group that researched coronaviruses in the Wuhan lab. Fauci would only admit so much, however, swearing that this research, well, it didn't qualify as that risky gain-of-function stuff. Dozens of scientists called BS on that, but the point is now moot, because documents emerged proving Fauci was wrong, that EcoHealth Alliance was doing gain-of-function research in Wuhan, a fact that ultimately the NIH itself was forced to admit, though it denied Fauci actually knew, or that the research had any link to what we now know as COVID-19. Fauci maintains he was shocked to learn the truth that the research he had approved was in fact gain of function. After all, he had been denying this allegation under oath for months. Well, his denials are clearly questionable, especially when one considers that EcoHealth Alliance was not exactly stealthy about the work it wanted to pursue. In 2018, it actually hit up the Defense Department for another grant that was rather on the nose. Its goal? To partner with the Wuhan lab, deliberately inserting novel furin cleavage sites into bat coronaviruses, making them more transmissible to humans. The grant was turned down as clearly too dangerous, but as prominent science journalist Matt Ridley reports, quote, "It is an open secret in science that you sometimes put things into grant proposals you have already started doing." And the Chinese Academy of Sciences was funding most of the work in the Wuhan Institute of Virology anyway. EcoHealth's CEO, Peter Daszak, was one of the first to beg officials to reject the lab leak theory, and tellingly, he warned that the public release of the virus's genetic sequencing would bring, quote, very unwelcome attention. Best case scenario is Fauci and Collins had every reason to suspect what Daszak and Wuhan were doing, but looked the other way or were reckless in their oversight of a dangerous lab funded by you, the American taxpayer. Worst case is they knowingly funded it, then tried to cover it up when things went south and COVID-19 emerged, of all places, smack dab in the middle of Wuhan, China. Fauci and Collins were told immediately by their expert pals, this thing looks man-made, or at least like it grew from passing from animal to animal in a lab, perhaps one that uses humanized mice like the Wuhan lab. But these two men prized international harmony over a full-throated investigation. The narrative was changed and discussion was shut down actively and forcefully, using charges of bigotry and conspiracy mongering. And the world's top scientists and the slobbering media let them get away with it. Nor is this over. Not only does COVID-19 continue to morph and circulate and cause havoc across the world, the Washington Post's Josh Rogan reports that the Biden administration wants to spend millions more right now to resume risky virus research in other countries. This, as Anthony Fauci is calling on Congress to give him a few $1 billion a year to develop vaccines for pandemics that do not yet exist. And when asked this week to come clean about these exchanges with the world's top virologists about the origins of COVID-19, he dodged.
Did you communicate with the 5 scientists who wrote the opinion piece in Nature where they were describing, there's no way this could have come from the lab?
That was not me.
Did you talk with any of those scientists privately?
You keep distorting the truth. It is stunning how you do.
Did you talk to any of the scientists privately
Yes.
who wrote the opinion? You did.
Well,
what were they telling you privately?
Well, let me explain. You're going back to that original discussion when I brought together a group of people to look at every possibility with an open mind. So not only are you distorting it, you were completely turning it around, as
Were most
you
of the
usually
scientists
do.
that came to you privately, did they come to you privately and say, no way this came from the lab? Or was their initial impression, Dr. Gary and others that were involved, was their initial impression actually that it looked very suspicious for a virus that came from a lab?
Senator, we are here at a committee to look at a virus now that has killed almost 900,000 people. And the purpose of the committee was to try and get things out, how we can help to get the American public. And you keep coming back to personal attacks on me that have absolutely no relevance to reality.
The push for freedom is multiplying. You can feel it, can't you? The demands for a return to normalcy, for a return of the people's rights, like the right not to wear a mask, to say what gets injected into one's body without fear of losing one's job or education, to require truly informed consent on mandated medical treatments, to go to school without a mask, without plexiglass, without being treated like a leper when you're there. You could see it at the Defeat the Mandates rally in D.C. on Sunday. Thousands of protesters in the cold, standing up for a return to liberty.
And I also want you to know, spoiler alert, freedom wins.
The papers tried to dismiss the event as, just a bunch of MAGA folks with "Don't Tread on Me" signs. But this was not a partisan event. Brett Weinstein, who helped organize it, is a liberal. Yesterday on this show, a self-described lifelong Democrat called in to say she had driven 8 hours to be there. This isn't about left-right. Last weekend, I had dinner with 10 women in New York. These were women who voted for Joe Biden, some of whom campaigned for him. Women who considered themselves liberal and proud of it just 1 year ago. All of whom had effectively been red-pilled. Some just registered Republican. Most openly prayed that DeSantis will be our next president. A few even mentioned Trump in a positive light. And all are furious about ongoing draconian COVID policies at the local, state, and national level. These are responsible, loving, kind, professional women, moms, who hand sanitized, masked, quarantined, homeschooled, and didn't complain for nearly a year in a city devastated by COVID. But 2 weeks became 2 months, became 2 years, and nothing has changed. No off-ramps are provided, not just in New York City, but in many cities and states run by Democrats. And any complaints on behalf of themselves or their children are repeatedly met with, "Do your part, how dare you?" or "People are dying." Case in point, Barry Weiss, another liberal friend of ours, who has seen the light on COVID. On Bill Maher, she appeared this past weekend, followed by a CNN doctor responding to her. Watch.
You get the vaccine and you get back to normal. And we haven't gotten back to normal. And it's ridiculous at this point. This is going to be remembered by the younger generation as a catastrophic moral crime.
The United States lost 10,000 people last week. She needed to grow up because she's acting like a child. And when somebody who is relatively young and relatively healthy says that, what they're saying is, I'll be okay if I get this virus. Screw you.
He's mad because Barry said she's done. People are dying. He's not wrong about that. We all get that. The CDC says it was 7,000 people last week, not 10,000, mostly seniors. We have no idea how many of them actually died from COVID, as opposed to just dying with COVID, a distinction the fearmongers keeping these tallies refuse to make. But yes, people are still dying from COVID, which is not going anywhere. And so we are faced with a decision now, after 2 years of this, of how we are going to handle this reality and also foster the well-being of our children and ourselves. The COVID death rate matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. And guess who realized that first? Moms, like my new pals. And they are not selfish to say they, like Barry, are done. Their kids missed nearly a year of in-person school. When after 12 months of remote learning, they attended an Open the Schools rally, they were called white supremacists. Their kids still play basketball, dripping with sweat into a mask, and while mandatorily vaccinated. The children, as young as 2, have been forced to wear masks for 8 to 10 hours a day for nearly 2 years. The kids' ears are sore, their faces are broken out, they can't breathe as well, they can't understand one another, they don't know what anyone's smile looks like. They've been forced to eat lunch outside on the ground while 6 feet apart, sometimes in frigid temperatures. Many children are not even allowed to speak during lunch, including last year, my own. They see each other, other children at lunch, only through plexiglass. They're no longer allowed to sing at school. They're harshly scolded or even threatened with expulsion if their mask dips down below their nostrils. Hi, Horace Mann, talking about you. These kids lose playdates because other kids' moms are too scared to allow socializing. Their extracurricular activities have been canceled, along with their prom, their homecoming dance, their bar mitzvah. Is it any wonder the CDC says attempted suicides by teenage girls in the pandemic have gone up 51%? That stress, anxiety, and depression among children has doubled since this thing started? These moms live in a city in which neither they nor their children can go into a restaurant, a Knicks game, a theater, or a gym without a vaccine and a mask and now a booster and their papers. A city in which CRT is rampant. In the schools, violent crime, including murder, has spiked to record levels. Mentally ill vagrants are cutting up men in ATM vestibules and throwing innocent women in front of oncoming subway trains. They are dealing with a lot. They are doing their best to not scare their children, to give them normal lives, to play down their fears, not stoke them. Why doesn't the harm to these children being done during this pandemic count? Why do so many others belittle it or dismiss demands for normalcy as selfish? People like those who host The View, for example, who undermine these New York moms and others just like them. Yesterday, they took aim at Bill Maher, another liberal, who has also had it with the COVID hysteria.
I don't want to live in your paranoid world anymore, your masked paranoid world. You know, you go out, it's silly now. You know, you have to have your mask, you have to have a card, you have to have a booster, they scan your head. Like you're a cashier and I'm a bunch of bananas. I'm not bananas, you are.
That messaging? Not okay for the ladies of The View who love to mask, vax, and above all, shame.
That's not really funny to people who've lost their kids to this vaccine, or people who've lost family members. This is not something we're doing because it's, sexually gratifying. This is what we're doing to protect our families. And you don't have to do it, but stay away from everybody. Then stay out of the public, man. This is not, nobody wants this. I don't want it. And I think he's forgetting that people are still at risk who cannot get vaccinated. People who can't get that. Little kids under the age of 5. Yeah. Or people with health conditions. How dare you be so flippant, man?
Well, they act like they're over it, like a relationship. I'm over it. I don't feel like seeing him anymore.
Once again, people are still at risk. Don't you care about the people who died? What about the children? How dare you? How dare you, Whoopi? For 2 years, the American people have sacrificed incredibly during this pandemic. They have proven over and over and over again they're not a spoiled, selfish bunch of brats. They lost jobs, businesses, careers, marriages, life savings, while at the same time, in many cases, losing parents, friends, colleagues, and teachers. They get it. They watched their children's anxiety, stress, depression, and even suicidal ideations go through the roof, all in the name of doing their part. They wore masks when they didn't want to. They got vaxxed and boosted when they didn't necessarily need to. They missed graduations, weddings, births, even funerals. They did all of this because they do care. And they were willing to make sacrifices for the good of society. But that calculation involves a balancing test. And at some point, the safety provided to society by these measures will no longer outweigh the negative impact on one's self, one's family, and one's community. And we're there. That's what Barry and Bill and these moms and I are saying. We have vaccines. We have therapeutics. We have PCR tests. We have antigen tests. We know far more about this virus than we used to, like the fact that we can all get and spread it, vaccinated and masked or not. And it is time to try to get back to normal. Like those red-pilled liberal moms that I met. I have young kids, and I also have an 80-year-old mother. And I get the need to protect the young and the old. My mom, she takes precautions and we help her. But she would never want our children to stay in COVID purgatory until all risk had been abated. Why are we treating our seniors, most of whom lived through far more challenging times than we have without caving to their fears, as if they are incapable of handling risk? They're strong. They know how to protect themselves. And most of them have no interest in burdening their children and grandchildren, even if it would eliminate some risk to themselves. As for children under 5 who cannot yet be vaxxed, Whoopi, what a red herring, and you know it. The COVID death rate of healthy children under 11 is approximately 0. What these kids need is not more restrictions, it's less. They need to go to school, to see their friends' faces, to play, to sing, to play sports, and get their heart rates up and have their faces uncovered while doing so, to eat lunch indoors, and to laugh and talk not through plexiglass, to have their proms, their graduations, to not be treated like they are dirty, disease-carrying killers. One final note. Some, like Whoopi's colleague, Sarah Haynes, take a different view. They maintain this is the new normal. Listen.
To the post-mask part, because I think there's a prudence we've learned with the mask, kind of like 9/11 with flying, is always going to be here now. There's a new normal. I think some of the things we've learned in this pandemic are going to stay the same. I may never ride a subway again without a mask. I may never go indoors to big crowds and never feel comfortable without a mask, and that's up to me to do that.
If Sarah would like to do that, fine. But I choose something different. I do not accept her new normal. The moms I met do not accept her new normal. Most Americans don't. We have never voted for these restrictions. They were handed down by leaders declaring emergencies that have now lasted years. It's not okay. It has to end. And if you agree, you have to fight. Now is the time. It's past time. Fight. Write your governor, your congressmen and women, a letter to the editor, attend a rally, call your principal. You don't normally do that? Too bad. It's time. And vote. Vote like my new friends in New York are going to do. Vote in November like your future and that of your children depends on it. And don't let anyone shame you for demanding your rights, for protecting your children after 2 years of enormous sacrifice. We did our part. This isn't selfish. Liberty is a right, and none of this ends until we insist on its return. The Biden administration is appealing the decision, striking down its mask mandate and all federal transportation, including airlines, buses, trains, and so on. This despite the ubiquitous images of people literally dancing in the aisles of airplanes, celebrating the end of this pointless thing. Not only is this appeal a colossally stupid political move, it is also a legal loser. The left had a meltdown this week over the judge who killed the mandate. But I've now had the chance to read the entire decision. And the reason they are attacking the judge and not her judgment is that the opinion was entirely sound. It is well reasoned, it is methodical, it is well supported legally, and in its descriptions of this administration's executive overreach, it is absolutely devastating. Here is what the judge, Catherine Kimball Mizell of the Middle District of Florida, found. First, the CDC had no independent authority to issue such a sweeping mandate. And any powers it did have would have to have been granted to it by Congress. So did Congress empower the CDC to enact such a broad mandate? No, found the court. See, back in the 1940s, Congress authorized the CDC to enact regulations aimed at preventing the spread of communicable diseases. This is what the DOJ relied on in arguing the CDC does have the power to mandate masks on federal transportation. But the law at issue provides examples of what the CDC could regulate. And it doesn't come close to gargantuan powers like forcing private citizens to wear garments on their faces for hours at a time. It covers things like fumigation, disinfection, sanitation, and so on. Sanitation, that's our hook, so thought the CDC. That's how we'll get them masked up. But the court was not convinced that a mask sanitizes anything. Sanitize, it found, means to clean something, which a mask clearly does not. But zoom out a bit, all right? And it is clear that neither Congress nor the CDC themselves ever envisioned powers like this for this regulatory agency. Prior to COVID, this law had been very rarely invoked. The most radical thing it had been used for was to prevent the import of small turtles due to salmonella risks. That's it. Then COVID hit, and the CDC was suddenly drunk on its own power, using this 75-year-old statute to shut down the cruise ship industry, to stop landlords from evicting tenants who hadn't paid their rent, and then to enact this mask mandate. All three moves have now been struck down by the courts. The court looked at the CDC's behavior and said to agree that it has such power would be to bestow the CDC with newly discovered, quote, breathtaking, unheralded authority. Something more akin to state police power than to an agency regulation over cleaning. So no, Congress never intended to grant little Rochelle Walensky or her predecessors with the powers of a king. And even if it did, the CDC went about it all wrong, found the court. You see, it would have had to provide the public with a chance to comment on this proposal for a period of 30 days. Why didn't the CDC do that? The CDC claimed, quote, given the public health emergency of COVID, it simply couldn't. Judge Kimball Mizell saw right through that lie. This mandate was not issued until nearly a year into the pandemic, 11 months after the president had declared COVID a national emergency, and at a time when COVID cases were on the decline. 30 days now couldn't be spared for the public to weigh in on an agency rule that had the power to send them to jail? Nah. Nor did the CDC comply with the requirement that in dispensing with that 30-day notice and comment period, it provide a brief statement of the reasons why involving the peons of the public was allegedly impracticable. Instead, it offered a single conclusory sentence about this being a public health emergency. And that's it. The court pointed out that when another federal agency mandated that certain healthcare workers get the vaccine, that agency provided 4 pages of reasoning. And 4 justices of the Supreme Court would later find even that was insufficient. The CDC here, 1 line, public health emergency. They didn't respect the public enough to even explain why the people should have no say whatsoever in, quote, a regulation that would constrain their choices and actions via threats of criminal and civil penalties, including a $1,000 fine, a year in jail, and civil penalties from the FAA for, quote, unsafe behavior. Finally, the court found that the CDC failed in its obligation to explain why it rejected viable alternatives to mandatory masking. The CDC's only response was to repeat its oft-cited belief that universal masking reduces transmission of COVID. Okay, said the court, but this mandate did not require universal masking. It allowed anyone under 2 years old not to mask, people with certain disabilities not to mask. It exempted people who were, quote, eating, drinking, or taking medication, as well as those who were, quote, experiencing difficulty breathing or feeling winded. The court pointed all of this out, getting right to the heart of what we've all known from the start of this thing. How does any of this make sense when we can have the mask down for long periods while we're eating and drinking? What you knew was nuts while on board that airplane, the court saw too. You weren't crazy. It was all a farce. And the court saw right through it. Thus, the court concluded that in addition to being not authorized by Congress and not being appropriately enacted because it skipped the necessary notice and comment period, this rule could not stand because it was arbitrary, it was capricious, it was unnecessary, it was nonsensical. For all of these reasons, the mandate was found unlawful, which is why I believe this ruling will be upheld on appeal. It'll go up to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is a more right-leaning court. And the U.S. Supreme Court is more right-leaning these days as well. So one, if not both of those courts, is going to wind up upholding this. I do not believe the Supreme Court, if it gets there, will strike down this ruling. Finally, a word on this judge. Her left-wing critics excoriated her because she never tried a case before reaching the federal bench. But the real problem they have with her is that she was a Trump appointee who once clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas. As Glenn Greenwald pointed out yesterday on this program, you know who else never tried a case before getting to the federal bench? Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, who's now 2 levels above Judge Mizell on the federal bench. Don't remember the liberals complaining about that then. It is true that the American Bar Association rated Judge Kimball Mizell not qualified, despite her extensive experience clerking for federal judges in the most prestigious courts in the United States and her time litigating at one of the best firms in the country. But make no mistake, the ABA cannot stand conservatives. It has a long history of rating as unqualified conservative judges whose positions on abortion, affirmative action, and the like it opposes. Its bias toward conservatives has been the subject of books, articles, endless commentary, and so on. It has deemed not qualified some of the most respected judges in the country and has a particular penchant for doing so to conservative women and minorities. Because as we all know, the left reveres identity, skin color, sexual identity, gender identity, unless the person is a Republican or not woke. But Judge Kimball Mizell does not seem to care about currying favor with the left, the ABA, or any particular group. She cares about the law. And thank goodness, by the way, for Mitch McConnell and President Trump, who, despite their differences, worked together to get judges like her on the federal bench.